This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. In this program, I'm going to be concentrating mostly on women of yesterday with death days and birthdays, mostly birthdays, of course, of some women, many of them from the 19th century. But June is coming to a close. It's almost the end of June. We're taping on the 28th of June now. And so these are some birthdays, death days of women from the latter part of the month of June. We talked last time about Lillian Hellman, born on June 20th, which was my birthday also, and the fact that Lillian Hellman had appeared before a congressional committee during the what we call the McCarthy era, the era of Senator Joseph McCarthy, when there was a lot of concentration on finding people who were communist or communist sympathizers in the early 1950s. And it is a time that I remember well because since I was born in 1932, I was a college student in 1950. So I'm going to talk first about a woman whose birthday is June 21st. And she's a very pretty woman. She was a well-known actress in the 1950s. Her name was Billie Holiday. Pardon me, Judy Holliday. There are two Holiday ladies, you know. Billie Holiday is actually a black woman who was famous in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. But this is Judy Holliday, who was, I remember her best probably from the movie she made called Born Yesterday. And she was a screen star and a stage star of the 1950s. Well, that's her claim to fame. But the reason that I'm talking about her in particular in connection with the McCarthy era is that she was also called before a committee. Now, Judy Holliday was not a goofy blonde, which was the roles that she played on screen and stage. She was a pretty smart gal, actually, but she had made her fame, really, by playing dumb blondes, scatterbrained women, you know, that sort of thing. And I guess we all know some women who are kind of that way. But Judy Holliday was like that in spades. At least the people she played on stage and screen were that way, very scatterbrained types, dumb blonde types. Well, as it happened, when Judy Holliday was called before a congressional committee and asked questions about whether she knew communists in stage and screen or communist sympathizers or what all, she put on, apparently, perhaps the role of a lifetime in that she played before the committee this dumb blonde thing, you know, getting mixed up and saying things that didn't follow suit and all that kind of thing. And finally, they just gave up on trying to get her to name any names of possible communists or communist sympathizers. So this is Judy Holliday, and her birthday was June 21st, just the day after Lillian Hellman. And she played a very different role, as you can tell, when she appeared before the congressional committee. Now, the next woman I'm going to talk about is very different. And actually, this is a day, but she is definitely a part of the era, the era of Joseph McCarthy and communist witch hunts and also searches for communist spies. Now, probably the best known communist spies or alleged communist spies were a couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And Ethel Rosenberg's brother happened to be someone who worked on the atomic bomb down in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And he was called as a pretty well-known communist sympathizer, and he named names. One of the names he named was his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. David Greenglass, the brother of Ethel Rosenberg, told the Congressional Committee that Julius Rosenberg was a spy who had sent to or given to a communist agent in the United States information about the atomic bomb. And Julius Rosenberg was arrested in August of 1950, I think it was. And shortly thereafter, his wife was also arrested. Now, it was not said that Ethel Rosenberg had handed any atomic secrets to communist agents, but it was pointed out that she had helped her husband, Julius, by typing up things for him. And so that was her profession. She was a stenographer, she was a skilled typist and so on. And she had often helped her husband with his typing of various letters and reports and so forth. And so it was said that Ethel Rosenberg had typed a number of documents which were given to communist spies. And consequently, she was also arrested in 1950. And it was, never, I don't know that they were able to pin anything more on her than the fact that she probably had typed up some documents for her husband. But they were both tried and convicted, and they were condemned to death as communist spies and agents for the Soviet Union. Of course, this was at the time when Joseph Stalin was still the dictator in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had taken over Eastern Europe following the Second World War's end in 1945, 1946. And it was a very tense time in American diplomatic history and just American diplomacy in general, as far as the Soviet Union, the largest part of the Soviet Union being the Russian Soviet Republic, which later, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, became the independent country of Russia, which we know today. Well, what does this have to do with June particularly? Actually, the day before Lillian Hellman and Lois Whaley on June 20th is dedicated to Ethel Rosenberg, because it was on she was executed on this day. She and her husband were both executed in New York State as communist agents on June 19th, 1953, 3 years after their arrest and subsequent trial and so on. They say that the last thing she said to her two sons, they had two young boys, who of course by now are well grown up, old fellas themselves by now, since they were born in the 1940s. But the last thing she said to her sons was, never forget that we were innocent. So she maintained to the end that they were not communist agents. Well, who knows? But that was definitely an important part of the McCarthy era and the search for spies and communist agents and sympathizers and so on. And I recall myself during my time as a college student in 1951 going to Sacramento to a very interesting day, which was, you know, very often groups go to the state capitol and testify or maybe talk to legislators or the governor or whatever. And that was the case in May of 1951, my last year at Stanford. I went in early May to a meeting in Sacramento. And as I recall, the most important people or the most famous people that were there that I happened to meet were members of the, quote, Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were 10 members of, I'm not sure there were any actors involved. They were mostly screenwriters, as I recall. Mostly screenwriters who had been named in front of some congressional committee as being either communists or communist sympathizers. They were blacklisted. In other words, they were barred from working in Hollywood for many years, and there were a couple of them who actually worked on screenplays during the time that they were blacklisted by appearing as, you know, under a false name, under someone else's name. There were a couple of those. Anyway, the Hollywood 10 were famous or infamous in the days of the Joseph McCarthy era, and I happened to meet one or two. I don't remember, you know, who they were especially, but it was a very interesting event. And one of the most interesting things about it was that there were two newspapers who were covering the event. One was the Stanford Daily. I had served on the Daily staff in 1949 and went with a new young woman who was new to Stanford actually that year in 1950-51. I had not known her when I had been on the Daily staff myself, but she was the person from the Stanford Daily who covered this event. And when we returned to Stanford, she did have a page one story about the Sacramento event. And a number of people were quite upset about that and wanted to know just who had gone to this terrible meeting in Sacramento. Well, that's probably the only time that my name actually appeared in the Stanford Daily, and that was toward the end of May in 1951, where I was named as one of 5 people from Stanford who had gone to Sacramento to this event where the Hollywood 10 were featured. And that was the only time I ever actually met a person who boasted of being a communist. He was not a screenwriter. He was a member of the Longshoremen's Union, which was headed by a known member of the Communist Party, Harry Bridges. Well, a little bit of strange history in my background there. June 19th, the death day of Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. Well, now let's get on to some quite different people and leave that era entirely. The next birthday I'm going to talk about is that of Pearl Buck. Pearl Buck was a famous author in my childhood. She was known for her writings on China. Well, Pearl Buck was born in the United States. In fact, she was born in Hillsboro, West Virginia. And, but her parents were Presbyterian missionaries who went to China, and she was raised in China. And in a way, she had two backgrounds. She had the American background, of course, of her parents and the times when she lived in the United States. I think some of the time she lived with grandparents in West Virginia. But she is best known, as I say, for China, stories about China, especially The Good Earth, which was a novel which she wrote in 1935 and which won many awards, was made into a movie in the late 1930s. And eventually, she was given the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is the international prize, you know, that was funded over a century ago by the inventor of dynamite. The inventor of dynamite was a man named Nobel, and he left his money to give prizes to people who did outstanding things in a number of different fields, one of the fields being literature, and Pearl Buck was given the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1939. She was the first American, and I think maybe even the first woman, no, she couldn't have been the first woman who got a Nobel Prize, because Marie Curie, who with her husband discovered radium, Marie Curie was given the Nobel Prize in Physics in the 1920s. So she was the first woman. She was from Poland, you know, originally, but she went to France and married her husband, and they worked to discover radium. Radium being very dangerous, actually, you know, it's used in order to make X-rays and so on, and eventually Marie Curie died of radium exposure. But Pearl Buck was the second woman and the first American woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. She has a certain tie to Ohio University, and if you go to Memorial Auditorium, to the side that has all the plaques of famous people who visited Ohio University, then of course there have been many, many famous people over the years, but they have plaques especially for former presidents who visited, like Theodore Roosevelt, like Lyndon Johnson, like Jimmy Carter. And they have plaques to people famous in other fields besides politics, so that one of the plaques is for Pearl Buck, who spoke at Ohio University. And about 20 years ago, when they decided they needed some more plaques up there, and hopefully maybe some more women, they put on 3 new plaques, and one of them was honoring Pearl Buck born in our neighboring state of West Virginia and famous in the 1930s as winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature for her books on China, especially The Good Earth, which became a famous movie. Well, I want to point out, I have here another book called Profiles of Ohio Women. Now, there aren't any Ohio women in here that I have found for June birthdays, but I want to, while we're talking about Pearl Buck, I want to talk about another woman who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, who is an Ohio woman. And actually, you know, I'm not sure whether she is still alive. She's slightly younger than me, if she's still alive, and she probably is. She was born in 1931, and her name is Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is famous as both a poet and a novelist. She is a black woman who has had an outstanding career in not only as an author, but also working in the field of publishing over the years, and as an academic, actually. Toni Morrison, born in 1931, received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Let's see, it says here, it was in the 1990s, I believe, in any case. We don't have a picture of her. Yeah. Although maybe Matt could find a picture of her because she is a famous author, an Ohio-born woman, and she actually has made most of her fame elsewhere rather than in Ohio, because she graduated from Howard University, which is in Washington, D.C., and she became an editor and faculty member at Howard, and then later an associate editor with Random House in New York, and a senior editor of Random House. But she is best known for some of the novels, like The Bluest Eye, and we have a picture. Blue in the background, and she's wearing blue. And she wrote about The Bluest Eye, which was published in 1970. And she's also well known for a book called Beloved, which was another winner, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And in 1989, she became on the faculty of Princeton University in New Jersey. So, Toni Morrison, since we have celebrated Pearl Buck, who has a June birthday, now I thought it would be very nice to celebrate another woman who happened to be born in Ohio, namely Toni Morrison, the famous author, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first African-American woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. Okay, well, back to June and June birthdays. The next person is someone who is known in literature, probably best known today in literature, but she was a real person who I remember. She was still alive when I was a young girl, and she was considered a great role model. Her name was Helen Keller. Helen Keller, and we have a picture of her as a young woman here, was born in Alabama on the 27th of June in 1880. And she lived to be quite an elderly lady, still alive when I was a young girl. Helen Keller was famous for having overcome tremendous disability. What happened to her was that as a toddler, you know, about the time of her second birthday, she was old enough so that she had begun to speak and walk and all that sort of thing, like toddlers do. But she had a terrible illness. And when the illness was over, she was both deaf and blind. In other words, all the usual things that we expect to enable us to learn about the world and to have relationships with people were denied to Helen Keller because of the fact that this terrible illness had left her both deaf and blind at about age 2. Well, when I say she's also known in literature, it's because a famous play was written about her life and how she became a very important role model person for people with disabilities. And that was the fact that the play that told about her life as a young girl, about 8 or 9, 10, about that age, was called The Miracle Worker. Now, The Miracle Worker was not Helen Keller herself, although we could say that her subsequent life, after she was able once again to be in touch with people and with life, despite her deafness and her blindness, was the fact that she was taught by a young woman who incidentally was a famous graduate of the school in Boston, which was for many years at least, was headed by the husband of Harriet Beecher Stowe. No, I'm getting them mixed up again. You've got to watch me carefully. I'm liable to get folks who we associate with Civil War confused. And of course, this is long before Helen Keller was born, although she was born in 1880. She was born in the 19th century. And her teacher was actually the wife of a famous man who ran this school in Boston by the name of Howe. He was the teacher of the miracle worker, woman who taught Helen Keller to communicate. You notice in the picture that she's using one of the senses that she did have, the sense of smell. She's enjoying a rose in this picture, and it shows her as a young woman. You know, eventually after she was taught to speak, she was dumb when the teacher took over, because her deafness and blindness had made it impossible for her to actually continue to talk. I think, as I say, she had done a little talking before she became so ill as a toddler, but not much. But she was taught by the miracle worker teacher to understand that everything has a name, and that was done by holding her hand underwater. Now, the teacher had tried and tried and tried to teach her this in various ways by having her feel things, and then the teacher would use her finger to write the name of the thing on the girl's hand. because that was the way that they could teach deaf people. And finally, Helen Keller, who had meanwhile become a very mischievous, uncontrollable small child, because she couldn't speak or hear or see. Helen Keller finally realized when the teacher put water over her hand from the pump. She actually got the girl to do the pumping, do the pumping, make the water come out. The girl was familiar with the pump. Helen was familiar with the pump. She knew how to get water out of the pump. And when the teacher wrote water in her hand, she finally realized that that was the name of what she was feeling, namely the water. And then she wanted to learn about everything. She wanted to know the name of everything. She would touch it and then hold her hand out for the teacher to put the name in her hand. And she became so literate that she actually went to college at about the age that most college students go, in their late teens. And she even graduated summa cum laude from college. Then Helen Keller went on, and she spoke out on many things. She was a very liberal person politically. When I say she spoke out on many things, she was able to speak somewhat eventually. But she also wrote things, and of course they could be published and read by many other people, so that she was still a very famous person for having overcome her disabilities and become an activist, actually a political activist in her lifetime. She was born in 1880. She would have been at least 50 years old in the 1930s when I was a small child. She was in her middle 50s by then. But she did continue to live and to work and to speak out for a long time. Helen Keller, the famous deaf and blind woman whose birthday was June 27th, 1880. Well, now we have another author here. We're really dealing with authors today, Pearl Buck, Helen Keller, and now Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was an author in the mid-19th century, a woman of an interesting background. She was raised, she was English, she was raised in London, and her father was a kind of a weird guy. One of the weirdest things about him, I guess, was that he didn't want any of his children to marry, and especially not Elizabeth Barrett, his daughter Elizabeth Barrett, who was a sickly girl, and but she had begun writing poems. She had become already rather famous as a poet in her 20s and 30s. She was born on June, no, pardon me, this is a death date, okay. She was born in the 1820s and became known as a poet. And eventually, she was contacted by Robert Browning, who was a younger man, who was also a poet, and who admired her poetry, and he started writing her letters. She responded, and finally they actually met. She didn't go out much because she was considered to be quite an invalid. She spent most of her time lying on a couch or, you know, sitting on a couch where she did writing and so on. She was 39 years old when she met Robert Browning, and he was, oh, about 30 at the time. He was somewhat younger anyway. Well, eventually what happened was that Elizabeth Barrett eloped with Robert Browning. They ran off to Europe and got married. And of course, her father was really annoyed since he had told these people, his children, that they were not to get married for whatever reason. It's like kind of unknown why he said that. But she had eloped and she got married to Robert Browning, and they even had a child, one little boy, one baby boy. However, their happiness didn't last too long because she died fairly early, and that's the death date that I mention here. Dies at 55 in 1861. But sounds like they probably, since she was 39 years old when she first met Robert Browning, they must have had some good years together and time with a child and so on before she passed away. But they did continue to live in Europe, like I say, because of the fact that her father was so annoyed by her getting married at all. She was well known enough as a poet in her day in the mid-19th century that she was even considered for the post of poet laureate. Now, that's a famous thing. We have poet laureates in America too, but in England they also have a poet laureate who often continues for quite some time. You know, the poet who his name is Hughes, and who married the American woman who became quite a famous poet herself. Robert Hughes was the poet laureate of England for a long time. In our own days, you know, in the late 20th century. Elizabeth Barrett Browning died on June 29th in 1861. And her sonnets from the Portuguese are still famously read. But probably she's a little sentimental for today's taste. Sonnets are a kind of an outworn poetical style, people think. I myself think that they're rather nice. They can be rather nice. One of my favorite poets is a sonneteer by the name of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And a lot of people say, oh, she's so old-fashioned, you know, she wrote sonnets. But I thought that she wrote some pretty doggone good sonnets myself. And also, she was politically inclined in some ways. One of the sonnets that she wrote was about dictatorship. She wrote it in the 1930s when we certainly had some awful dictators around, not only Stalin in the Soviet Union, but Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, and some people who aspired to be dictators and did become dictators in the 1930s, like Francisco Franco, the general who was the most famous general in the Spanish Civil War, who fought against the Spanish Republic from 1936 to 1939 and who won. And this year, since this is 2016, is the 80th anniversary, soon upcoming actually, of the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, which eventually brought Francisco Franco to power. And he was the dictator in Spain from 1939 until 1975, when he finally died himself. Well, like I say, Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote a poem about dictators, and I think she had in mind Cuba, actually, at the time. But she certainly was living at a time and writing poetry at a time when there were a lot of well-known dictators around: Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. And so poetry can be anything. It can be sweet and sentimental and love poems, you know, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, or it can be politically oriented, like some of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetry. Well, now I want to talk about someone, since there's one more day to June. You remember the famous quote, 30 days has September, April, June, and November. June has 30 days. And so the last day of June, which is going to be upcoming soon, is the 30th. And here's another author, E.D.E.N. Southworth. She died at 79 in 1899, which means she was born, I guess, about 1820. I don't think you've heard of E.D.E.N. Southworth. I never heard of her either until I read this book, Remember the Ladies by Kirsten Olson. I had not heard of her either. But she was quite well known in the 19th century. She was one of those popular authors, you know, who write like the things that a lot of people want to write. They want to read. They want to read light fiction, okay? Something that takes you away from the everyday life that you're living and enables you to get lost in a story. Well, E.D.E.N. Southworth was a woman who was an author like that in the 19th century. And she wrote voluminously. She wrote several of these lightweight novels a year for years and years. They say that she published over 60 books, which were quite popular in the 19th century. Light fiction, you know, probably kind of a lightweight love story, whatever, or something about the home and the family that was not your own home and family, and that you could read and get away from everyday life with in the 19th century. Her name was E.D.E.N. That was her initials, Southworth. She was married to a guy named Southworth. Well, so why is she even in this book? Well, maybe it is good to remember that there were well-known people in the 19th century who have since totally dropped out of history. But the thing is that her most successful novel was called The Hidden Hand, and I think that was, one of those Gothic novels. One of those, she wrote a number of Gothic novels, sort of horror stories. Nowadays, people like to watch horror stories or science fiction or whatever to get away from everyday life. Well, she wrote similar books. And the reason that Kirsten Olson chose her for this book, apparently, is that, this is not her picture, But, oh, Matt found the Hidden Hand book there, and there's the cover. So apparently it's still in print or is still available. But the thing is that she was satirized by a woman who still is well known for writing in the 19th century, and that was Louisa May Alcott. Now, she didn't call her Eden Southworth. She called her Slang, slang, Northberry. And she was satirized by Louisa May Alcott in Little Women. So you never can tell who's going to turn up. Now I want to turn to, because it's so close to 4th of July, I want to turn briefly to 4th of July stories. And here is one from the Ohio women. Now, we don't have a picture of her, and I'll just bet you that she cannot be found, a picture of her cannot be found by Matt. I'm putting him on his medal. Maybe he'll try. Her name was Betty Zane, and every Ohio school child has heard of Betty Zane and the fact that she was a heroine of the American Revolution. And her name, her family's name, was given to the little town, the big city, whatever you want to call it, that's just about 50 miles north of us here in Athens, Zanesville. Zanesville, Betty Zane. She actually was known for two events during the American Revolution. On one occasion, when she was, both cases she was quite young, because they say she was born about 1759. So I don't know, I think she must have been born a little bit earlier, because it's said that the first way that she became well known, at least to the British, was the fact that she was living in Philadelphia during the American Revolution as a teenager, and some British officers stopped at her uncle's place and were being fed supper, and they'd left their horses outside. There's a statue of Betty Zane. She ran off with their horses. They say there were 40 horses. She must have been quite a good horsewoman and able to, get the horses to follow her, because she ran off with their horses, supposedly 40 horses, and turned them over to George Washington, who happened to be in Philadelphia at the time. That must have been quite early in the American Revolution. But she's best known for the last battle of the American Revolution, even after Yorktown. Yorktown is considered the last battle of the American Revolution. But because that's when the British gave up at Yorktown in Virginia, surrendered to Washington, and the American Revolution supposedly ended. However, they didn't get the word out about the end of the American Revolution for a while, so that the actual last battle of the American Revolution was in 1782, and that's the one that Betty Zane is famous for. She was sent away by her uncle from Philadelphia because the British were pretty down on her case after she had stolen those horses. And they sent her out west, what was west then, to Wheeling, West Virginia, where she had 3 brothers who lived. And there was a fort there held by the British in 1782 still. And there was well, let me put it this way, the fort was held by the Americans, but the British and the Indians, who hadn't heard apparently about the end of the American Revolution, attacked the fort, Fort Henry, in Wheeling, And the people who were in the fort, the Americans in the fort, ran out of ammunition. So Betty Zane, who was a young woman in her early 20s, and an athletic type and independent, suggested to her brother, who was in charge of the fort there, that she go and find some more gunpowder. And that's what she did. She ran to the house next door, which belonged to another brother of hers, and he had a keg of powder that could be used in weaponry. She put it in a tablecloth, not the keg, but the gunpowder itself, in a tablecloth tied around her waist, and ran back, you know. In the meantime, the British and Indians who were attacking the place couldn't quite figure out what was going on, and they didn't really start shooting at her, but there was shooting going on. She dodged the bullets, and she got the gunpowder to her brother, and they were able to continue the fight and did not have to surrender to the British and the Indians in the last battle of the American Revolution. Well, I also want to point out, finally, speaking of the American Revolution and July 4th, Remember the Ladies. That's the title of our book, Remember the Ladies. That's a famous quote from a famous American woman by name Abigail Adams. There's a picture of Abigail Adams. She was the wife of John Adams, the second president of the United States, and she was the mother of John Quincy Adams, who was also president from 1824 to 1828. But she is well known for her letters that she wrote, especially the letters she wrote to her husband, John Adams. They were separated a lot because John Adams, this was before the United States was the United States. John Adams had spent a lot of time in England and Russia and so forth, and but he was back in the U.S. in 1776, and he had gone from Boston, where they lived, or near Boston, where they lived, to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting. And he was on the committee that was writing up the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Thomas Jefferson is given most credit for that, but it was actually a little committee, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, who developed the Declaration of Independence, which was actually signed by the Congress on July 2nd. But it was not proclaimed until July 4th, and that's why July 4th is the official Independence Day for the United States of America. Well, Abigail Adams had written to John Adams during the time he was working on the Declaration of Independence. And she said, remember the ladies. You know, after all, you're talking about independence. What about us women? And he wrote back and he said, I can't believe it. You know, what do you mean, remember the ladies? We've got to work on getting independence for the men in this country, at least. Well, he didn't say at least first, but I guess that's what he thought. And so she subsided. However, she had spoken to him very firmly about this matter, and she had said that maybe the women would foment a revolution themselves if they were not included in independence. And that was the thing that really set John Adams off. Imagine, women fomenting a revolution. Unbelievable. Well, We know that women have supported independence. They supported independence for themselves and voting for themselves, but that did not really get going until a number of years after Abigail Adams died. And I'm thinking about the first declaration of sentiments, as they called it, at Seneca Falls in 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the author of that. And about 1851, when Ohio had its second independence for women, votes for women conference in Akron in 1851, and our sister from Washington County and Morgan County, Frances Dana Gage, was the person at that meeting who called up Sojourner Truth, who spoke that famous speech about, "Ain't I a woman? You know, we women can do just about anything if you give us a chance." So, when we think about 4th of July, let's also think about votes. Let's think about voting. This is the year for voting for president. And let's think about the American Revolution, Betty Zane, Abigail Adams. Let's remember the ladies on July 4th. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.